The Imjin War, a war that would be described by historians as the Asian World War. We are going to dig into this war, battle by battle, through the heroism, bloodshed, and strife. I'm Stefan, and this is Japan at War. In the late 16th century, Toyotomi Hideyoshi had united Japan after 100 years of brutal war known as the Sengoku Jidai. For Hideyoshi, though, this wouldn't be enough, and by 1585 he began expressing the desire to expand to China and even India. Now, some have suggested that this desire wasn't just simply the desire to conquer, but so that the now idle Japanese feudal lords, known as daimyo, wouldn't plot against him in the peacetime. With his eye on China, Hideyoshi began communications with Korea in 1587, with the assumption that they would let his forces march right through Korea and into China untroubled. But the Koreans were an ally of the Ming and refused these kinds of talks entirely. Hideyoshi assumed that Korea would be an easy prize on his way to China, and that waging war there would only result in lost time replenishing his army before setting off for his true goal, China. Now, while this ambition sounds crazy, he actually had a reason for thinking this way. And the Ming had the allegiance and received tribute from Korea, Thailand, Vietnam, Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and the Philippines. Despite all this, though, China was actually in decline. During the same year as the Imjin War, the Ming would have to deal with the Baozu Rebellion and the Ordos Mongols. And while its standing armies were big on paper, China would find itself hard-pressed to field an army greater than 200,000, in my opinion. Though it has been estimated by others that they had around 800,000 that they called to service, which is still an incredibly large force, but is much smaller than the 3 million that was listed in the official registries. Now, although Hideyoshi didn't know any of this, in fact, the Ming courts hardly knew this themselves. What he did know was that China had a long-standing inability to defend its coasts from pirates known as the Waiko pirates, who based themselves on the outlying islands of Japan. This signaled to him that perhaps a professional army would be able to take the country by force. And it just so happened that he could now call to arms the entirety of Japan, that not only had a lot of troops, but a ton of well-seasoned veterans as well. But what made Ming China appear so weak? And why did it seem to be in decline? Outwardly, China seemed incredibly powerful, with territories stretching from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the Tibetan Plateau in the west, and from Burma and Vietnam to Manchuria and the Mongolian steppes. Despite its power, though, it's true, Ming China was in decline, the roots of which actually date back to its first emperor, Zhao Yuzhang. During the later years of Mongolian's Yuan dynasty, there was uncoordinated peasant uprisings, which eventually grew into an organized opposition that pushed the Mongols back and eventually out of China entirely. Now, Zhao Yuzhang took advantage of this unrest to rise through the ranks. and actually became the leader of the newly liberated China. Zhao then restored many of the traditions of the previous dynasties, and would later become known as Hongwu, which means vastly martial in reference to his now vast military power. He used Confucianism as a means of managing his new empire, but actually didn't take much interest in himself. The man was incredibly despotic. He was temperamental, violent, paranoid, and would frequently put officials to death if they crossed him. To give you an example, in the year 1380, Hongwu learned of a plot against him by his prime minister. Hongwu not only sentenced the prime minister to death, but his family, friends, relations, and casual acquaintances, until around 40,000 lay dead from the incident. He then abolished the office of prime minister as well as the entire central secretariat. Hongwu then took it upon himself to micromanage much of the nation's day-to-day business, along with an inner circle of court eunuchs to help him. He would place China under strict central control with enforced frugality empire-wide, and this would actually fall in line with the Confucian principles of his government. Taxes were kept low, and communities were left to police themselves, requiring them to collect their own taxes and deliver them to the capital themselves. Officials in the government were also paid very little, which fell in line with the idea that they should have to provide for themselves through other means, and not through the government. Military garrisons were ordered to support themselves as well through agriculture, which saved the nation the financial burden of supplying them. And tools and labor for public work projects were to be supplied by local communities rather than the public purse. This actually resulted in a rather impressive start to the Hongwu's government. Under this ideology, the treasury would constantly be full, and agricultural development was forced to increase, and trade expanded. During this time, China was incredibly powerful. But after the Hongwu emperor, things began to change. His successors used the Confucian-inspired bureaucracy to assert themselves, and monarchs were gradually isolated to the Forbidden City in Beijing. These monarchs were forced to be confined to a tradition-bound role as figureheads and were kept busy with court rituals, audiences, and lectures. And while trade had been given relatively free rein in the past, it started to be discouraged under some of the early to later Ming emperors. And profit via trade was largely distrusted by Confucianists. To them, agriculture was the real source of prosperity. Development, at least for some, was no longer the national goal. It should be traded for stability. Ming China enjoyed many years of stability, but it would not last. The generations of bureaucrats had moved away from the system set up by the Hongwu emperor, and they made so many alterations that actually left the nation vulnerable to outside threats. Threats like Hideyoshi.